And Jason, it's awesome to be back with you, man.
Yeah, dude, it's always good to see you. We don't see each other enough.
I know, but whenever I do see you, it seems like it's been on a screen. We've done a couple of these events post your books launch. But so I don't know how many of the members out there watching this will have read Hell of a Book or have necessarily gotten through all of it. Can you give us just kind of a quick synopsis, your elevator editor's pitch?
Yeah, I'll try to. I'm really terrible at elevated pitches, though, so we'll see how this goes. Hell of a Book is essentially the story of an author on book tour. As he's traveling through his book tour, he begins hearing news reports of a police shooting that's occurred of a young Black boy, and the author is trying to avoid the subject, avoid facing it. And as he does, it explores the kind of the state and the history of being Black in America and like the emotional kind of psychological toll that can sometimes play on people.
So I remember it would have been 2018, I think, that I met up with you and another writer that our members might know, Taylor Brown, who's author of books like Fallen Land. He's got a new book coming out in a couple of weeks called Wing Walkers. And we were at a coffee shop for an article that I was working on, meeting up. And you had just come off book tour. I think it was for your third novel, if I'm not mistaken.
Probably, yeah.
The Crossing, yeah. And you were just like flabbergasted. You were just spent with just the chaos of book tour. And I think you had like a super intense driver at one point, and there was just all this stuff. So can you talk a little bit about what book tours mean for authors, both the good and the bad, and the pressures that come with book tour, and maybe how that led you to at least consider writing one half of what is, I think of as kind of a braided novel?
Yeah, for sure. And it's funny because like I literally just came off of another book tour, so I I have a lot of fresh memories of what a book tour is.
Spill them, share it.
Yeah, I'll try to not give away too many wild secrets, but yeah, book tours are this really unique double-edged sword for authors. On one side of it, you get to finally go out and meet readers who have actually read your book, typically. And that's a really awesome thing. Like, as an author, you spend so much time alone in your little cave with your project. Nobody gets to see it. It's this very secret thing. It's just you and the page. And then all of a sudden your book is published and you're not sure how people feel about it. But then one day you get to go to an event and people are there and they actually like ask you questions about the book, and you get to engage with people who are usually really intelligent, who have done like really deep dives into the book sometimes, or just want to find out more about writing. So you finally get to socialize after, about something that you love, which is your writing. So it's this really awesome, heavenly thing on one side. But the other side of that, the darker side that doesn't get discussed often, is there's a personality conflict that occurs where most writers, not all, but most writers are typically introverts. Like, they're not really good in front of crowds. They don't really like mass groups of people. They don't like the attention. That's why they kind of sit in a cave and write. It keeps them out of people's way. But when you're on tour, suddenly for weeks on end, you're very much in front of people. You're very visible. You're answering questions and you're being interviewed, and you're kind of bounced from city to city to city. You're at airports and flights, and people on flights are asking you about your book. And like, you're way more engaged socially than you're probably comfortable with. And that can cause a lot of stress and a lot of anxiety. One anecdote that I will give from literally just this week, where I've been traveling all month, and I'm not even gonna say, I'm trying not to give the author's identity away, because this is a very personal kind of event, but I met an author who was literally on the edge of like a nervous breakdown, because they had been traveling, because when their book came out, they did everything over Zoom. So they didn't have to see people face to face and do all the traveling. And now that things are opening back up, they've been on the road for like 3 weeks straight. And like, they wrote a really big book that got a lot of mass attention. Like, if I said the name, like, you'd be like, oh my God, I know. Like, it's a really huge book. And we were getting ready to do an event together, and they basically were like, I can't do this. And I was like, what do you mean? They're like, I can't get in front of these people. I've been getting in front of people for a month, and like, I can't do it. I cannot go up there and talk to these people. I just can't. And I said, you don't have to, like, because the authors don't know how to say no when you're touring. You're like, you feel like you can never say no, so you say yes to everything. But this person was like, I could see that they were on edge of like a nervous breakdown or just having a really bad moment. And I told them, it's like, you don't have to do this. Like, there's no one going to make you. And thankfully they did. They didn't do it. They chose not to go up there. And we spent like the next half hour, me and this other author, like consoling them and making sure they were okay and trying to like talk them down out of the state of panic they were in. because that's what happens when you take really reserved, quiet, solitary people and you stick them in front of audiences for weeks on end. It causes a lot of friction, a lot of anxiety. It's very wacky and very strange.
Yeah, and that's one thing that's so interesting about the book. So I want to begin by talking about this author that's on book tour. And you open with a very comedic moment. Our author is bare naked. He's running down a hotel corridor. He's fleeing a jealous husband for reasons. Naked man, jealous husband. You can put two and two together, dear reader, and discover for yourself why this man is fleeing nude. And it's funny and it's bizarre, and he has this like really hilarious interaction with an older woman in the elevator that she kind of like just, it's just run of course for her. There's a nude man in the elevator with her. And you think like how bizarre this is, but then he realizes he has to go down to the front desk, to get a room key because he left his clothes in the room he's just fled from. And he's worried about proving his identity, but he turns around and his face is on the cover. I think it's of People magazine, right? And so it's almost like you're exposed no matter where you go. But our author has a particular ability to deal with that exposure. Can you talk about his peculiar ability to kind of start every day new again? It's both a curse and a cure for him.
Yeah. So the author in question, author in the novel, who is just known as the author. I mean, people wonder, why aren't you saying his name? Like, the author is just known as the author throughout the novel. He's not really given a name for very specific reasons, but he has a really active imagination, to say the least. Like, he can kind of just drift in and out of his imagination almost at will, sometimes unwillingly. He actually struggles to remain grounded in the real world more than anything else. And so for him, every day is different and imaginative and strange, and it's a really good escape mechanism from like the reality of his life and the reality of the world. But yeah, he really imagines way more, and he can't control it. And this kind of begins to be problematic eventually. It starts off in a very comedic kind of light, but eventually we start to see what happens when you kind of detach from reality for too long. Reality eventually catches up with you, you know?
Yeah. And what I found so interesting was this guy's just trying to survive book tour, right? He's just, there's a scene where he's on the way to the airport in the back of a limo or a car a driver that's driving him. He doesn't really know what city he's in. And it sounds melodramatic, but that's not an uncommon thing. I know you've had that experience. And you think like, I've been on my fair share of book tours, and you think that like, I'm never going to forget where this particular thing happened on book tour. But then it all kind of blurs together after a while, and the hotels run together, and the fast food runs together, and the bookstores run together, and it becomes like one long blur of event. And so this guy, your author, is trying to protect himself against the chaos of book tour and all the eyeballs looking at him. But he's also trying to protect himself from a larger cultural, historical trauma that has been visited upon him forever. And can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So the author is, like I said, his imagination works in two ways. Like, it's also like a double-edged sword, where it allows him to escape reality and escape his own past and his own history, and kind of lets him just be in the moment, which is, the thing we kind of all strive for, I think, in life, to just kind of exist and to not be weighed down by the baggage of things that have happened to us. And that can be a very powerful thing, a very positive thing. But the problem is, it also detaches him from these things that are important. Like, there are parts of the past that you should not forget and that you should remember, and that should be a part of how you exist. And so for the author, like, he has kind of gotten to where he's detached from the reality of the fact that he's even Black. Like, there's a moment in the story where like he kind of remembers someone has to tell him that he's Black. And he has this like shocking moment of like, are you kidding me? Like, just really trying to process, like, what do you mean I'm
He
Black?
looks at himself. He's like, what?
Yes, exactly. Because he's that far gone from reality and from all the ramifications and the consequences that kind of come with that. And as the novel moves on, like, that is one of the things that he explores. Like, what does it mean to be an author and to also be Black? Like, how does that change your experience and your options and your availability and all these things about who you are? How does something as simple as skin color change your ability to be an author. Like for him, that's part of what unfolds.
And you can answer this as personally as you would like, or just keep it in the confines of the book. But
Sure.
there are moments in the book where the author is called upon to shoulder the burden or portrayal of entire segments of people, whether it's Black people, whether it's Southerners, whether it's North Carolinians, rural people. That very rarely happens to me. When I go on the road, people aren't asking me to explain whiteness, right? They're not asking me to explain the contemporary moment through my very titrated, narrow perception. Sometimes if I'm the only Southerner, I don't have a really strong accent, maybe I'll get comments about, why do you say y'all? Maybe, but I've never felt put upon as a representative. Can you talk about how the author in your book is placed in that situation, and if you've ever had any experiences that you want to share where maybe you've felt that?
Oh yeah, for sure. Like it is, I mean, yeah, that's a common existence for me, like, and for the author in the novel, but also for me in particular. Like I am the ambassador for Black people wherever I go. Like I should get like a sash and have like a bodyguard. Like there should be a whole thing that comes along with it, because like anywhere that I am, particularly like for like, literary events, if there's any discussion, and this is before, Hell of a Book definitely discusses race in America. My other novels, like it's very much in the background. There are some discussions about it, but it is so far in the background. Those novels aren't really about that. But yet, even at that time with my previous novels, any event that I went to, if there was going to be a question about race, it was going to be fielded to me. It was just a given. If there was any article that needed to be written and my publisher was looking for someone to write some article dealing with race, it was going to be coming directly to my inbox. When I am teaching, like those kinds of questions, like just this week, like everyone wants to know like my take on the Will Smith, Chris Rock thing, because they're both Black males, and like they want to know the deeper, how does this reflect on like the entirety of Black culture? I don't know. Like, what do you want? Like, why would I know like the entirety of Black culture's view on this one event? And yet that is oftentimes how it happens. And the thing is, like, I understand it. Like there's a part of me that, rubs against it and feels the friction of it. But at the same time, I kind of understand it. We recognize, we all, and this is all of us, myself included, we all recognize that there are other groups that are not like who we are. And there are events that occur sometimes that affect those groups differently than it affects us. And so when you find someone who is from that group, whatever it is, it can be race, creed, color, religion, gender, sexuality, whatever that thing is. Like if you got a friend who does that, you want to ask them like, hey, how do you feel about this thing? And by proxy, you're kind of wondering how others like them feel. So I totally understand the instincts, but I think the challenge is that when it becomes your identity, when it becomes a thing you're locked into, where it's almost as if that's the only thing that people want to hear about from you, that becomes a problem, because then you squash and you reduce the voice of that group of people to just telling you about that one thing when they may have multitudes of things to tell you about.
Yeah, and one thing that I found really, and that's one thing that people, if they haven't read this book, they'll see that this is a novel that has a lot of moments that are incredibly funny. And then while the reader is laughing, you'll slip in something that either makes us feel uncomfortable for having laughed or makes us pull the laugh back in, right? And so there's a lot of like instability in the novel that just feels very alive. And that happens continually in the scene where the author is recalling his media training.
Oh, yeah.
And all the degrees of Blackness, and not in terms of culture, but in terms of presentation. Mm-hmm. We want you to acknowledge it, but we don't want you to be too much it. Can you talk about the pressures of that for this author going out on the road?
Yeah, so the author in the novel, he meets with a media trainer to talk about his book. And that's also based off of reality. Like my first novel, I actually had to meet with a media trainer who taught me to talk about my book, which is a very weird process. It's actually quite helpful. Like I make fun of him in the novel, but the reality is it can be quite helpful, but it is also very weird because they tell you that like, no, that's not actually what your book's about. Here's what your book's about. Here's how you talk about it. Here's how you guide that conversation. And so for the author in the novel, he encounters this media trainer who is telling him about the fact that like you don't want to lean too much into the fact into your book being about like blackness or race or any of those things, because that's not what people want to hear about. Nobody wants to hear about that. It's too charged, it's too polarizing, it's too topical. You need to keep it in the center, keep it in the safe space, talk about love, talk about all those things that are familiar to people that we kind of just, love to hear about. And again, like the cost of that for the author in the novel is that like it's reducing his voice. It's making him disappear, which is one of the themes of the novel, like this visibility versus invisibility thing. And so for the author in the novel, he just very much begins to lose himself and like retreat more into his own imagination, because the real world doesn't really want him to be who he is. The real world wants him to be this very unique kind of caricature of who he actually is, and he kind of leans into that.
And on the other side of this braided narrative is a young boy living in rural eastern North Carolina. And you mentioned themes of disappearance. That certainly is that's what it opens with. This little boy trying to disappear at the behest of his parents, encouraging him figure out how not to be seen, right? And then we have the role of fantasy, even in his life, with his father's love for movies, his father's desire for everything to be okay, the way his mother is willing to almost live in an imaginary world of safety. Can you talk about the other half of Hell of a Book, the story of this young boy?
Sure. So the other part of Hell of a Book is the story of this young boy named Soot. He's 10 years old in a small rural North Carolina town, southeast North Carolina town. And, he has very, very dark skin. He's known as Soot because the bullies talk about how his skin is so dark, it looks like soot. And that becomes like his nickname throughout the novel. Mm-hmm. And so his parents are they play this game with him, which, if you're a parent, if you're not a parent, like kids love to play this thing where like, you can't see me. They'll sit somewhere and like, if their eyes are closed, you can't see me. It's this whole invisibility game. The novel opens with Soot's parents playing this game with him. And then as the novel evolves, you find out that like, in their own way, they're playing this game with him because as he grows, they want him to kind of be able to, interact with America and with police officers in particular, and just stay in the background, like don't get noticed, because there's this fear that if especially if you're a Black male, like if you are noticed, you are in danger. Like you are more likely to have bad interactions with law enforcement, whether you want to or not. Now I've got a lot of personal anecdotes regarding all that. But it's their parents' way of kind of keeping their child safe. And throughout the novel, the parents dread the moment because they know like this is a farce. Like this is not a real way to make this happen. Like at some point, you have to have what's called the talk with your children, particularly if you have minority kids, where you talk to them about how the world functions differently because of your skin color, and that's something you've got to learn to deal with and navigate. And it is an inevitability. It's something that cannot be wished away and cannot be imagined away. But for the brief time that he's young, his parents kind of have this dream and this hope that maybe somehow he actually can turn invisible and be safe and all these things. And I don't want to give away too many spoilers, but as the novel kind of goes on, it explores that even more.
You talk about the talk, you reference it, maybe not the talk specifically, but all of the things surrounding the talk as the bonsai of a childhood, this slow trimming away of a little less love, a little less possibility, a little less, dreaming. Can you talk about that in terms of Soot's character and his community?
Yeah. Soot definitely has, a very vivid kind of breaking moment where his childhood kind of comes to a very harsh end. And it is that thing where after that moment occurs, like his imagination, his vision for what his life can be gets reduced down more and more. It is like that trimming away of all his possibilities. And he starts to realize that his community is not safe from the outside world. It is not safe. It is not invisible. It is not this hidden place where the bad things don't come and happen. It is this place where, terrible things will happen to people that you could kind of love. And that's the reality of life. And so for Soot, he eventually starts to escape into his own imagination. Like reality begins to get reduced down so much that it no longer can fit. He no longer fits within that reality. So his imagination begins to kind of take hold in a very similar way to the author's imagination, but Soot that becomes his means of finding who he is and finding his space. He has to imagine it.
Mhm.
He has to imagine his space, and that's where he starts to live.
How did you go about braiding? Like, where did the idea come from? You have this comedic, uh, hyper surreal story of the author on book tour with this very realistic, for the most part, kind of somber reflection on Black childhood and in the rural South. Where did the idea come to braid these two storylines into a cohesive book?
Honestly, like, so braided novels, like I would argue that all of my novels have been braided to some extent. You go back to The Returned, when you go back to, Wonder of All Things, like they'll have one main story arc, and then throughout that they'll have other events that are occurring here and there along the way in the outside world. And a lot of that is because I really love the challenge from a writing standpoint, just like the craft side of things. I love kind of seeing like how far apart I can set the goalposts, and just how I can make them meet in the middle. How I can like take two things and just weave them in and like blend them together really nicely. And it because it allows me as a writer, I don't have ADHD, like I don't have attention issues, but like I love to see things that are, this thing is way over here and this other thing is way over there. But if I'm attentive enough and I pay attention as a reader, I'll start to see how these things that seem very distant and separate are actually very linked and tied together. Because I think that's how we exist as a planet. I think it's how we exist as people. We always think of people as being very different and very far away. And then you spend an hour talking to someone and you find out, oh, we've got all these things in common. So like these existences that we all have that feel very separate and feel very foreign and very far apart, like over time you eventually come to discover that, like, no, like we all care about our children, we all worry about bills, we have a lot of things that are very similar. And I think that is what my work tries to do. I try to take all these disparate things and show the fact that like they're all linked, they're all tied together, and they all kind of mean something in one unified whole.
Mhm. So, you're from Eastern North Carolina. You're from North Carolina. You still reside on the land where you're from, which I find just incredible. And I'm sure some days it is and some days it's not. But I find it just incredible because I think that's just a testament to I don't know, to the power of place, and an awareness of wanting to be in a place is, I think, one of the great freedoms that we can have, especially as Southerners, to be honest. How did growing up in Eastern North Carolina influence you trying to put Eastern North Carolina on the page? And can you talk really briefly about, I think of you as, you won the National Book Award, you have this like really experimental wild novel, but I still kind of think of you as a rural writer.
Yeah.
And that's not dismissive. I think that's awesome and engaging that this incredibly powerful experimental book came out of a rural place. So can you talk about living in and writing about Eastern North Carolina and then writing from a rural place?
Yeah, sure. Like I think so. One thing I've learned is that people are really baffled by the fact that I live in a small town. Like I'm not sure why, but like there's something about rural life that really perplexes a lot of people. Like so much as I travel about and I tell people, because I still live in a town of about 800 people. Like it's a very small town. Like I just got internet a month ago. Like this whole interview is happening from my home only because I got internet literally a month ago. So this is a very exciting interview for me for different reasons. But when I tell people that, and I tell people that I live in this, one stoplight town, they think, they're like, why would you do that? Like, why would you live in this town? And the short answer is like, I love it. I love the quietness of it. I love the space. I love the fact that there isn't traffic outside my door and strangers running around all the time. I love that I can go outside at night and I hear crickets and I see stars. Like all of that influences my writing because it calms me and it makes me feel very secure and safe. I mean, this is the land where I grew up on. So like my parents have passed away. So I still have memories of them when I go outside in the morning and I do things. It's all very rooted in, the people and places that I love. And so as a writer, one thing that I really love doing is I think people equate small town living with like small world view. Like they imagine that, and there are those people. There are those people who live in like these little echo chambers and they're never leaving and they're never going to grow as a person. And that's a group of people. But there are also people who just live in small towns who can buy plane tickets and travel to places and see things and interact with people and who can read books and who can explore in all the ways that others can explore and who have like these very vivid world views, and they can create art. And I think that is one demographic that I always want to be able to champion. I want to be able to let other small town writers like, that, hey, you don't have to go to New York, you don't have to go to Chicago, you don't even have to go to Charlotte, you don't have to go to Greensboro. You can exist wherever you want, especially with writing. You can just live where you want to live and where you're happy and centered, and still tell stories that grow beyond just small town rural stuff, or they can be rural and still have impact.
Mhm.
So for me, it is very much about this sense of like, the country boy making good and the small town boy making good. I think there's a lot of that in my writing and in my quest to just to, show that, yes, I can live on a dirt road, which I do, and still write novels that stretch beyond this small town, and novels that interact with people, and novels that say important things.
Mhm. So, this novel combines, a relatively traditional narrative with Soot and his family and their story with something more experimental, where we have this author with no name reimagining, recreating his world every day, going on these really hyper surrealistic adventures is the wrong word, but these events. I'm thinking about the mortuary. I'm thinking about just a lot of the things that he encounters. Can you talk about, pushing yourself as a writer and pursuing those two styles of writing in the same place, and then maybe talk about how, are you thinking about a reader then and thinking, gosh, I hope the reader will go with me, or do you think about the reader at the end and think, oh my gosh, I hope the reader has gone with me? So talk about that.
Yeah, so it was funny, like the writing of this novel, like this novel has surprised me in ways that people will never understand, because like as I was writing this novel, I knew it was going to be my greatest failure. That's what I called it. Like I was telling friends about it. I was like, this is going to be the best thing I've ever failed at in my entire life, because the novel was very weird and very different. It was very surreal. You've got film noir, you've got this high imagination, you've got this very serious discussions alongside like very comedic things. And I knew that the novel was it was going to take people in all kinds of places, and the odds of them actually being able to stick with it and navigate through it and actually feel compelled to stay with it, I just didn't feel like I could pull that off. So I was like, but there reached a point where I kind of said, I'm just going to write it for me. It's going to be the novel that I write for me. It'll be the big one that failed and nobody wanted to read, but it'll be the one that means something to me and that I loved writing because I had fun with it. Like I put in like really obscure references to like movies and stories, and I put Nick Cage in the book, and like there's all these things that I just threw in because it was just going to be something that I wrote for me and nobody else liked, nobody else read. So I was like, if I'm gonna go out, if we're going down, we're going down swinging. I'm going down having fun with it. But I did always hope that there would be a reader for it. So I did feel like I was trying my best to like pull readers along the way as best I could. But I definitely did not think it was working. Like I thought the novel was just, just not, it's going to be something that I was the only person who would get it. And I was the only person who would actually want to read it. And so for me to have it go on and like one, get published at all, like the fact that it even found a publisher was like, wow, really? Okay, cool. And then to have it go on and win the National Book Award is just absolutely unbelievable to me. Like every step of that process, I was like, oh man, it's cool that we got longlisted, but there's no way we're going to win. And then it was like, oh man, it's great that we got made finalists, but there's no way I'm going to win. And then by some miracle, I actually won. So like I said, like for me, the novel has just, the fact that it did bring readers along, that readers are finding all these amazing things in it and are able to kind of stay with it, is just really makes me feel really awesome, really terrific. Because again, it was the novel I doubted the most because I took so many chances and so many risks with things.
Do you want to talk about how other folks in your professional life might have doubted it as well, and kind of what that journey was?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, this is the novel that was shot down 8 times and got up 9 times, kind of thing. So the novel kind of began in a very, very nascent kind of form in 2013 after I went on my first book tour for The Returned. So I came back off of that book tour. It was 2 months of insanity, and I came back off of it. I was like, what just happened? I got to write about this. And so I told my agent, I said, I want to write a story about an author on book tour. And my agent goes, nobody wants to read about that. Like, cool idea, but no. And I was like, all right, fine. So I write my second novel, and I could do another book tour. And I was like, I still want to do it. I think an author on book tour story would be great. And my agent and my editor were both like, nah, no, thank you. Nobody wants to hear about that. Go write something else. And so I went off to the side and I wrote this, half a manuscript that was just a comedy about an author on book tour. I even made like a screenplay version of it and sent it out. And it actually did, it won like a contest or two in screenplay form. It's like, oh, cool. But it didn't have any of the serious topics. And so then after my third novel, I was out of contract and I had no one to answer to. And so my agent and I were talking and she said, what do you want to work on next? And I said, I still want to write this author on book tour story that I've been wanting to write for years now. And my agent goes, well, I don't think that's gonna be a good idea, but send me what you got and we'll take a look at it. So I sent her like the first 50 pages, which again was very different than what the final form was. So this is not knocking her judgment. It's saying like it was a very different thing I sent her. But she read it and her actual words were, she's like, I'm not very excited about this. Like she's a nice person. She says, I'm not very excited about this. But what makes her a terrific agent was she said, I'm not very excited about this, but if you are passionate about it, if it is a story that you want to write, who cares what I think? Go off and write it. She goes, you don't need my permission to write things. If it's what you want to do and it's what you're excited about and passionate, go do it. Don't worry about what I think. Just go write the thing. Send it to me when you're finished with it and we'll figure out what to do next. And so I did that. Like I went dark for all, I had, barely talked to her for like a year and a half when I was working on the book. Because I said I wanted to just finish it and send it to her and see what happens. And I sent it to her and she absolutely loved it. Like she immediately just fell in love with it. So yeah, it's one of those things where it was definitely, shot down multiple times, but honestly, like not necessarily for the wrong reasons. I still think the authors on book tour stories are things that people want to read about. But I will also say that like the 50 pages I sent my agent in like 2017, something like that. They were very different than what I finally wound up writing at the end because I just had to go through some changes to make that happen.
I want to ask folks if you have questions for Jason about anything he's talked about today or about this book, you can ask your questions in the chat and I will ask him your questions. So please start loading those in there if you do have questions. And I can tell you that Jason has talked about this book since before it was coming out. And the only thing that has changed are the questions. So if you feel led to ask good questions, ask good questions. Authors like questions because it's the only thing that feels new.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about your writing practice? You're someone that I admire for a lot of reasons. But first of all, I really like you, and I've known you for a while, and I've always really thought highly of you as a person. But whenever your books have been successes as they all have, and winning the National Book Award, I'm always really happy because you're a writer that works so hard, and you can't say that about all writers, and we don't. But some writers don't feel the burn to write the way that you do, and don't hustle as much as you do, and haven't made as many sacrifices as you have. So when you talk about writing and your writing practice, I always listen really intently to what you have to say. So can you talk a little bit about what your writing day looks like or what your writing habits are?
Yeah, sure. I am very habitual in my writing. Like I have a very stringent regimen that I stick to. And I think it's been one of the things that helped me kind of progress as a writer, where I wake up at about 5 or 6 a.m. every day, depending on, what, the season or whatnot, 5 or 6 a.m. And I go straight to the computer. That's the thing that I try to do first. Like I don't check my email. I don't log on to the TV. I wake up, I go sit down on the computer and I start my fingers moving. And a typical work day, like when I'm writing a first draft, like there are different phases, but when I'm in a first draft phase, like I have to do 10 pages a day. Like that's my quota. Like it's mandatory. If I don't do 10 pages, I can't get up from the chair. Like I can't, stop writing. And, on a good day, 10 pages takes me like 2.5 hours on a really awesome day. So I get off work early and I kind of get to relax. On a bad day, 10 pages can take me like 12 hours. Like I've sat there from like 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. just trying to get those 10 pages out. But I do that almost every single day when I'm not touring, of course. When I'm on a normal schedule. And that keeps my fingers moving and keeps my thoughts active. And it also just helps me, honestly, emotionally and psychologically. Like I've been writing since I was about 14, often like I didn't get serious till I was about 20, but like I started writing at 14. And so I'm at this stage now at, 43, where like I've got almost 30 years, that's terrifying to say, but I've got almost 30 years of like writing under my belt. And like writing is how I figure out my life and how I figure out the world and how I how I figure out like challenges in my day to day. Without writing, I slide into depression, like without being too honest, too blatant about it. Like if I don't write, I will get depressed because I need to sort through things, and writing is the means to which I do it. So writing every day helps me stay healthy. It helps me be a writer, which is great. But more importantly, I think it actually helps me stay healthy emotionally on the internal side of things.
Yeah, because I mean, another writer in town, Kevin Maurer, says being a writer means you always have homework. And when your homework isn't done, you can't relax, you can't clear your mind, you can't fully engage with the world because it's always in the back of your mind. I should be writing, I should be getting this thought down. Something has been left undone that I need to do, that I need to finish. So I hear you on that. Can you, before we take questions, can you talk a little bit about, and I've thought about this often, you mentioned it to a class of mine that you were so kind to join in the fall, but your big working file when you're working on something. Can you talk about that for a moment?
Oh yeah. So I do I do these big files where, like, when I have a story idea or a novel that I'm working on, anytime I'm working on a project, like a novel in particular, I would have this, like, I call it a support file, which goes off to the side of that. It'll be on my computer somewhere. So I'll have the main body where I write all the actual words and it's the characters and story stuff. But then in my support file is where I put just random thoughts and ideas and things I want to come back to. So the support file may be just an idea for a cool scene. It may be just a really interesting line of dialogue that I had. It may be some random fact that I want to look up later and find out about. Like I found out about some, like, for instance, yesterday, and I got to find a way to use this, but it's in my support file for the new thing I'm working on. I found out about how in 1917, you could mail people for about 15 cents. Like the US Post Office for 1 year allowed you to mail people. Like, and there's a picture of like the first baby that was mailed. And there's a postman standing with a satchel and there's like a baby in it about 9 months old or so. And he only went 1 mile. So like, it's not a terrifying story like that. It was only mailed like 1 mile to the house nearby. But yeah, for like a full year, you could mail people through the US Postal Service from 1917 to 1918. So things like that will go into my support file because I know I will find a place for that weird fact. And because there's a lot to unpack in that moment. Like there's a lot to unpack in the fact that you can mail a child through the Postal Service. So yeah, I have the support file where random things like that I just go into that file. And like when I was traveling this month, because I've been on the road all month for tour stuff, I haven't been able to just sit at my desk and write for 5 or 6 hours because I've been on the road. But what I do is, my phone is with me. So I've got like a file in my phone that's like, I'm on a flight and I have this, some character in my head starts talking. So I take my phone out and I type it all in there and I save it on my phone. And then like tomorrow morning when I get up, I will actually like dictate all of that into my support file and start trying to figure out how does this fit into the project that I'm working on right now, which I'm hopefully ready to get back to work on tomorrow. Like, because I was on the road until Friday and I've been recovering from book tour for the last few days. But finally, tomorrow morning, when I get up at like 5 a.m. or 6 a.m., it'll be back to the support file, back to the document, start work going again and get back into that rhythm.
So you're always working, whether you're sitting at the desk or not. Your mind is you're always thinking, recording something. So we've got some questions. One of which I know you're not going to answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Then I'll go to the next one. Are the author and Soot the same person? And if so, in what ways?
Yeah.
Next question.
Next question. Totally not answering that question. I will say that is for readers to decide. That's why I don't answer that question. It's for readers to decide.
So can you tell us about the genesis of the book's title?
Yes. So that's a funny story. So an interesting piece of trivia that will never come up in any trivia session is the fact that I have never titled any of my books. Every novel that I've written has been titled by someone else, either my agent or my editor, because I apparently really suck at titles. Like I'm really bad at titles and I've just accepted that and it's just fine. Like sometimes we're bad at things. So my agent and I were revising the book. We had not sent it to publishers yet. We had not sent it to editors yet. It was just her and I working on it. And we were like late stage. And, we had talked a little bit about the title. She was like, hey, what do you have in mind for a title? And like, I was like, I don't know. She goes, okay, you got a month. Like in a month, we need to have a title locked in. I was like, okay, cool. And then it becomes down like a week before the deadline. She goes, hey, how's that title hunt going? I was like, I'm working on it. I'll figure something out. She goes, okay, fine. And then cause she knows how I struggle with titles. So like 3 days beforehand, she's like, hey, hard ask here. Like, what is the title going to be? And I was like, I don't know. I sent her like a list of 10 different things. And she replied back like, these are all not good. She's like, none of these work for the title. And she said, let's just call it Hell of a Book. And I said, no, that is as a hard no. That is the worst title. I said, I am not that arrogant of a person. There's no way I'm going to have my book sitting on a store shelf calling itself Hell of a Book. Because so like a few years ago, Dave Eggers wrote a really amazing book called Heartbreaking Work of Staggering Genius. And I thought that was the most arrogant, pretentious title that you could ever have for a novel. Like I remember seeing it in the bookstore and being like, oh my God, are you serious? Did you actually call your book that? And so my agent was like, so, because when you read the novel, for those who haven't, the author in the novel has written this really big book. And every time someone talks about it, they say, oh my God, you wrote such a hell of a book. Like it becomes a joke, like a running gag. But it's also a metaphor for like the book writing process and all these other things. And so my agent pointed that out and she goes, Hell of a Book is the perfect title. And I still fought it. I said, no, because like, think of the reviews. Like if someone doesn't like it, they're going to say, oh, hell of a failure or hell of a bad book. Like there's so many ways to pick it apart if people don't like it. So, and she goes, finally, she said, unless you have something better, which I know you do not, we're going to go with calling it Hell of a Book. And I was like, okay, I tapped out. Fine, do it. And now, you know, in retrospect, it seems to work, but I fought that tooth and nail for a long time.
And I know you're a Nicolas Cage fan. He's in the novel, and I was texting you about his new movie just a couple of days ago. And his new movie is called The Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent.
Yes, I love it. For him, he could do that. Nick Cage can make it, he can pull that off wholeheartedly. I cannot, but he can.
I still think you got to get to that premiere. I see a connection coming. Someone asked, can you talk about the women in the novel, specifically the mother and the Kellys?
Yeah. So there's a lot of interesting things with the women in the novel. The mother in particular, you know, she's trying to make the best of what is, you know, a very bad situation, to put it lightly. She's trying to be protective of her son, of her husband. She's trying to kind of give him the best future that she can. And yet she struggles with the fact that like the future that she wants him to have is oftentimes hindered by reality. Like there's a lot in this novel about like the dream of life and the reality of life and how the two are oftentimes incongruous. And so the mother is trying her best to be a good mom and protect her child and to give him the best future that she can. And yet she knows that there is, in a certain form, a ceiling to it. There are certain parts of his imagination that will be clipped off and pruned when, you know, when she has the talk, when she lets him know about how the world will treat him when he goes outside those walls. So there's that. And then there's also this component of like the author's mother. Like I'm trying to tiptoe around spoilers and things like that. But the author, you know, who is one of the main characters of the story, there's this thing where his mother has, you know, passed away, and there are things that he has not dealt with in that regard. And a lot of the novel is him trying to come to terms with like what that means to him, his avoidance of her death and the coping of that. So there's that. And then there's also the Kellys, which is the Kellys are just this very fun, well, not just, but like the Kellys are this very fun dating kind of component where the author keeps meeting women named Kelly. Like he dates like 5 women named Kelly, and they all are, you know, very unique dating experiences. And then at one point he finally meets this one Kelly who actually he finds a connection with, like he finds the right one. Like there's this theme in the book of maybe he's just, because the book starts off, one of the first lines of the novel is, this is all a love story. And so there, on the dating side of things, he has this opportunity where like after going through all the wrong Kellys, he finally finds the right Kelly. And there's this question of, will this work? Will it not work? And again, try not to like give too much about the novel. But yeah, like the Kellys become this very interesting metaphor for like the search for love and the search for fulfillment that we oftentimes will put into other people. Whereas, you know, the truth is, you know, we've got to find fulfillment in ourselves before we can try to find it inside anyone else. And the novel kind of tries to explore that.
Here's another question. Who are the authors who have inspired or influenced your writing?
Sure. So three of my biggest touchstones for writing are John Gardner, who wrote October Light and Grendel and a bunch of other things. William Golding, who wrote Lord of the Flies, The Inheritors, and a bunch of other things. And then Toni Morrison, who, you know, all the amazing stuff that she's written. So those are like that's the big trinity for my writing my kind of background. But also like Dalton Trumbo comes to mind. Hunter S. Thompson comes to mind, particularly with like the dreamlike aspects of the novel. There's a lot of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas that bleeds into this novel and kind of, influence a lot of that kind of structure. So yeah, so those are a lot of my favorite authors. But then I also took a lot of inspiration from filmmaking. There's a big theme of film noir, and that go a lot of those directors of that entire genre. And then the Coen brothers. I'm a big fan of the Coen brothers comedies. Raising Arizona, Nick Cage, Coen brothers.
Oh my God,
amazing movie.
so good.
Yeah, so it's not just writers that influence things. There's also directors and other storytellers as well.
Were you thinking about Dalton Trumbo's novel, Johnny Got His Gun?
Yes.
Oh my God. So many people haven't read that novel that are,
I know,
that
and
are
it's a travesty. Like,
ours.
yeah,
It's
Dalton,
so good.
yeah. How Johnny got his gun, it blew me away the first time I read it. Like, it just stunned me.
Me too. I was young. I think I was in high school. I think maybe a senior in high school, and it was required. And I remember reading it and thinking, I didn't know novels could do this.
Yeah, I was in college and came across it, and I had the same reaction. Like, I didn't know a novel could do that. Like, I didn't know that like you could pull off. I know you could pull that. I didn't know it's possible to pull that off, and it just blew me away.
Same thing with Toni Morrison. You mentioned Song of Solomon. I read early on in college and just thought, I didn't know novels could move me like that. And
it's good to get
like
it's good to get floored by a novel from time to time.
Absolutely, yeah. So here's another question. In the novel, the author thinks, I know for sure that I'm back in North Carolina. I know the smells, humidity, pine trees, and veiled racism. And the South is America's longest running crime scene. Do these reflect your own experiences?
Yes, indeed. I mean, so here's the thing, like a lot of times people hear that line or hear some of those comments and they think that I hate the South, which is the absolute not case here. Like, I love the South. Like, I've remained living here for a reason. There's a reason I don't live in New York, because New York's terrible. But no, I love the South, and I do not ever want to live anywhere other than the South. Because the Southern culture, the Southern people of all races and identities, like there's just this unique, special feel that you only find in the South. The way that we can be polite, but still take a jab at someone in the politest of ways. Like, the first time you hear someone say, "Oh, bless your heart," like there's a lot to unpack in that phrase. It sounds so nice, but then you unpack it and you're like, I've had friends from up north who come down south, and it takes them like a year to figure out that when someone tells you "bless your heart," they're not being nice to you.
Yeah,
and it's like, yeah, that's the South, and like, so that dichotomy and that ability to have all these things, that it fascinates me and I love it. And yet at the same time, we cannot deny the fact that like the South has a troubled history. I mean, I was in Charleston a few years back, and my girlfriend and I were in this restaurant and we're eating food. And it was very terrific. It's a good restaurant, cool stuff, downtown Charleston. But literally outside the door was a slave market. And it's like, wow, that too. And you think about the fact that like so much of Charleston was built by slaves, and like there's so much blood in Charleston in the metaphorical sense. And that kind of speaks to what the South is. And so I'm always filled with this dissonance and I think that's why I write so much about the South, whether directly or indirectly, because I'm trying to reconcile these two worlds that exist where, the South is this beautiful, loving, welcoming place that is, fascinating with, boiled peanuts and fish fries and all those awesome things. And then they also, lynchings and, Confederate flags and all these other things that go on, and trying to navigate those two things is, part of the fascination of the South and part of why I'm here. Like, I think on some gut level, I'm trying to figure out the South. And of course I can't do it, but I want to, and I want to keep trying because I do love this place. And I want the South to be, to excel and to be a really great place. And that's, requires some tough looking sometimes.
Yeah, I hear you. And I feel much the same about writing about the South in my own work. And in the novel, our narrator, our author says, it's great to be back home in the South. I think site of America's longest running crime scene. And I remember when I taught the novel, and then in the next page, he says, don't get me wrong, I love the South. And the author does. And we talked about holding those two ideas in your mind at the same time, that for so long, Southern writers, Southern artists, Southern musicians had to be Leonard Skinner. They had to be Mark Twain. They had to be very, it had to embrace the South at all costs to their personal sense of morality or their understanding of history. But I think we've come far enough to where writers, maybe of our generation, maybe of generations just before ours, we can hold those two ideas in mind at the same time.
Yeah.
South needs work. I love the South, right?
Yes, exactly.
South isn't perfect. That we know I love the South. But as far as it being America's longest running crime scene, I thought that was such an astute thing to say, because in my class we talked about how when there is an investigation, the crime scene blends back into the general landscape. You don't know the crime scene is there because the ropes are picked up and the evidence is gone. But has the South really ever done the investigation?
Yeah, exactly.
Or is the crime scene still active?
Yeah, it's all unresolved. It's all very, yeah, it's still a very much an open wound and unresolved kind of moment, an unresolved location. And again, like there are times when it blends into the background. Like there are times when, I forget how the history of the South. I'll say that because you're so busy loving it. You're so caught up in it. But then you remember, or at least I remember, that like, oh yeah, this is the place where this horrible thing happened, and this is the other place where this horrible thing happened, and like there are all these places where all these terrible things happened, and they never resolve. They just kind of like, let's just forget about it and move on. Like there's a sense of like, well, just don't bring it up, don't talk about it, let's move forward. And I think we have to stop and resolve, because again, like you were saying, like the South needs work, and I love the South. There's two things that work there, and I think if you truly love anything or anyone, you want them to be the best that they can be. And that means being critical of them when it's time to be critical of them, and defending them. Like I defend the South to Northerners all the time. Like I have so many like Northern friends who are like, oh, the South is just this backwards racist place. I was like, yeah, but we make good food. It's like, yeah, you got to also defend the fact that like we're not backwards and we're not racist. Like racism exists across the country. As there's Northern racism, there's Western racism, the South does not own the patent on racism. It's like, that's kind of everything everywhere. And so you got to defend, like, I will defend the South. At the same time, I will turn around and critique the South because I love it so much. Like, I want it to be the best version that it can be. And I've seen the best version. Like, one thing I tell people is my parents have both passed away. My mother in 2001, my father in 2007. And I went to college and I met these great group of friends who, so my best friends are white, like these great group of friends who are white, and like their parents basically adopted me. So there is this wonderful couple in Southport who are, they're older people, and like they're white, but they are my parents. Like I call them with good news. I call them for my birthday. They call me for their, like, they are my new parents, and I absolutely love and adore them. And that is the South too. And I think people forget that, like, that too is the South.
Donna asked, are you familiar with the Bitter Southerner magazine, which acknowledges the duality of the South? And we are, because we did a story on Hell of a Book for Bitter Southerner, and I put the link in the chat right there if anybody wants to click on it to check out that story. And then maybe last question, what are you teaching at UNCW, and how do you teach your students?
Sure. So right now I'm teaching just a fiction workshop to grad students. So we're just kind of looking at, their work and trying to talk about the craft of being a writer. But one thing I really do try to teach students is like the life of being a writer. Like I think that is a part of the teaching thing that gets missed on students, because writing is not this thing that you just do for a few semesters and then like, your book takes over the world. Like, no, writing is this lifelong thing that you need to be able to do. And you need to be able to do it when you're not in class. You need to be able to do it when you're not under the structure of being in undergrad or graduate school. You got to learn that like the mystique of what a writer's life is just that. It's a mystique. It's not the reality. The reality of being a writer, like there's this dream, this romantic dream that has been adopted by Western culture, particularly American culture, that says, writers are just like millionaires and they're drunk and they're suicidal and they're womanizers, but they have fun. They don't do much writing. They do more drinking than do writing. And then like one day the muse comes and the muse says, write this novel. And they spend a week writing this book and it sells 1 billion copies. And that's just how the process works. And that is so far removed from reality. It makes my head hurt sometimes. So I try to teach students that, no, the reality of writing is you get up every day, you go to your computer, you write stuff that you hate, and you do that for like years. You just keep doing that for years. And that is what the process is. You're always insecure. You're never really confident. Like people think that, Jason must be way past the imposter syndrome phase. Like, no, I still feel like an imposter. Like maybe even a little bit more now because I won the National Book Award. And like, if you were to ask me who is a National Book Award personality, like what type of people win National Book Awards, I would not say someone like me. Like I would not say that at all. And so, yeah, like the act of writing is this process of constantly exploring and just making this thing habitual and just really enjoying the journey. Like, you know, that cliche saying about how it's not a destination, it's a journey. That's what writing is. And that's what I try to teach my students. Like, don't put timetables on yourself. Don't say, oh, I got to have this thing published by this time, or I'm too old to start writing, or I'm too young to write. Or like, no, just write and make it a part of your life, and it'll take you where you need to go.
I like that. Those are good words to close on. Make this thing habitual.
Thank you so much, Wiley and Jason, for joining us today. I did want to give a shout out to Jean Yoakum, who came up with the original recommendation for this book. She has recommended most of the books on Community Read. We are open to other suggestions people have. I also wanted to let everyone know that we will be posting this interview, the recording of this interview, on our in our newsletter next week. I did fail to disclose that we